A routine lunch turns into a nightmare when a racist cop strikes a black teenager in front of his father, unaware the man he's targeting is a powerful judge with the law on his side. As the system fights back to protect its own, the father and son's battle for justice exposes a web of corruption far deeper than anyone imagined. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Judge Daniel Carter, a man of wisdom, dignity, and unyielding principles, stood as a pillar of justice in his community. In his early 40s, Daniel exuded confidence and warmth. Despite his demanding career, he prioritized raising his 14-year-old son, Nate Carter, a bright and ambitious young boy with a knack for debate. The bond between father and son was unbreakable, their conversations often filled with teasing jokes and words of encouragement. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Daniel took Nate to Eddie's Diner, a bustling family favorite. They sat by the large window booth, their laughter blending seamlessly with the clinking of plates and the hum of friendly chatter. Nate had just been awarded the top prize in his school's debate competition, a testament to his sharp intellect and persuasive charisma. As their food arrived, Daniel toasted his son with a glass of lemonade, pride lighting up his eyes. "You keep this up, and Harvard better get ready for you," Daniel teased, raising his glass. "Harvard? Why not the Supreme Court?" Nate grinned, leaning back with confidence. Daniel chuckled, patting his son's shoulder. For a moment, the world outside the diner felt distant. It was just the two of them, basking in the joy of hard work and shared dreams. The idyllic moment was shattered when Nate accidentally bumped into another boy while walking back to their booth with a refill. A small splash of soda landed on the white sneakers of the boy, a wiry teenager with a scowl already forming. "Hey, watch it," the boy snapped. "I'm really sorry," Nate said, genuinely apologetic as he handed over napkins. "Didn't see you there." But the apology wasn't enough. The boy's older brother, Officer Mitch Turner, a broad-shouldered cop in his late 30s, loomed over them in his casual off-duty clothes. With a hardened glare and a confrontational tone, Mitch stepped forward. "Your kind always causes trouble," Mitch said coldly, his eyes narrowing on Nate. Daniel quickly approached, his authoritative yet calm demeanor shielding his son. "There's no need for this," Daniel said firmly. "It was an accident, and my son already apologized." But Mitch wasn't interested in reason. He grabbed Nate's arm roughly, his grip tightening despite Nate's wince. "Kids like this need to learn respect," Mitch spat, his voice echoing across the now quiet diner. Daniel's voice dropped to a measured calm, the kind that hinted at an underlying storm. "Let go of my son. Now." Instead of heeding the warning, Mitch turned his fury toward Nate. The tension reached its peak as Mitch's hand struck Nate across the face with a sharp slap, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the crowd, diners frozen in shock. Daniel immediately stepped between his son and Mitch, his towering presence a stark contrast to the boiling rage simmering beneath his composed exterior. Nate clutched his stinging cheek, tears brimming in his wide eyes. Not from the pain, but the humiliation. Daniel's voice, low and measured, was sharper than any outburst. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Mitch smirked, his arrogance blazing. "I don't care who you are. People like you don't get to talk down to me." But something in Daniel's unwavering stare planted a seed of unease in Mitch. Adjusting his collar, Mitch swaggered toward the door, muttering under his breath as he left. The diner remained deathly silent as Daniel turned to his son. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his hand resting on Nate's shoulder. Nate nodded, his face a mix of shock and frustration. As Daniel escorted Nate out of the diner, a murmur of whispers began to spread. Some of the patrons pulled out their phones, sharing what they'd just witnessed. What none of them yet realized was that this was only the beginning of a storm brewing, one that would expose far more than a single act of injustice. The drive home was silent, the usual banter between father and son replaced by the weight of what had just transpired. Daniel Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he glanced at Nate through the rearview mirror. His son sat slouched in the passenger seat, his cheek still red from Mitch Turner's slap. Nate's eyes stared out the window, his reflection showing anger and something deeper, hurt. Flashbacks flooded Daniel's mind, pulling him back to courtrooms and chambers where he had fought tooth and nail against systemic injustice. He remembered the cases of young black men unfairly prosecuted, families torn apart by biases that ran through the veins of the system he'd sworn to uphold. For years, Daniel had battled corruption and racism in the judicial system, but this time, it wasn't someone else. It was his son. His child was now a victim. As they entered their home, Daniel's stoic mask began to crack. In the soft glow of their living room, Nate finally broke the silence. "Why didn't you fight back, Dad?" he asked, his voice trembling. Daniel froze, his chest tightening. He walked over to Nate and knelt before him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "Because sometimes fighting smart is better than fighting hard," he said. "What Mitch did was wrong, but if I reacted the way he wanted me to, it would have only made things worse. For both of us." Nate didn't respond, his lips pressed into a tight line. He pulled away, retreating to his room. Daniel watched him go, the weight of his son's disappointment pressing heavily on his chest. When the house fell silent, Daniel retreated to his study. His judicial mind, trained to find cracks in the law, took over. Opening his laptop, he began digging into Mitch Turner's record. Using his connections within the judicial system, Daniel gained access to internal police files. It didn't take long to find a disturbing pattern. Mitch Turner's record was marred with complaints of racial misconduct, excessive force, racial profiling, and unwarranted arrests. But each complaint had been quietly dismissed or resolved internally. The name tied to those dismissals? Chief Carter, Mitch's superior, and a man known for protecting his officers at all costs. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read report after report. Mitch's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, more insidious culture within the precinct. Chief Carter had manipulated internal investigations, ensuring officers like Mitch faced no real consequences. As the hours ticked by, Daniel's resolve hardened. He wasn't just dealing with a rogue officer. He was facing a system designed to protect men like Mitch at the expense of justice. At school the next day, Nate's usual confidence faltered. Whispers followed him through the halls, and he overheard some classmates mocking him. "Did you see that video? His dad just stood there while the cops slapped him," one boy sneered. Nate clenched his fists, his heart pounding with shame. The viral video of the incident, shared by someone at the diner, had spread like wildfire. Though some comments online praised his father's restraint, others mocked them both for not fighting back. By lunchtime, Nate could no longer ignore the stares and whispers. He skipped his debate practice, retreating to the empty auditorium where he sat in silence, the sting of humiliation burning in his chest. At home that evening, Daniel tried to connect with Nate, but his son barely spoke. Daniel noticed how his usually vibrant and self-assured boy was retreating into himself. It was a painful reminder of how much this incident had scarred both of them. Daniel's investigation led him deeper into the tangled web of Chief Carter's cover-ups. Through discreet conversations with trusted colleagues, Daniel uncovered evidence of a larger scheme. Chief Carter wasn't just protecting Mitch. He had systematically silenced whistleblowers and destroyed evidence to maintain his precinct's reputation. One report stood out, a case involving another young black teenager who had been arrested on fabricated charges. The boy's parents had filed a formal complaint against Mitch Turner, but the case mysteriously disappeared. The father, a former city councilman, had resigned abruptly a month later. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. Chief Carter's power extended far beyond the precinct walls. He was not just protecting officers like Mitch. He was ensuring that the system itself remained impenetrable. As Daniel closed his laptop, he realized the fight ahead wouldn't just be about seeking justice for Nate. It would be about exposing the rot that lay at the heart of the institution itself. From upstairs, he heard Nate's faint voice practicing debate arguments in his room. It was a glimmer of hope, a reminder that they couldn't let Mitch and the system win. Daniel clenched his fists, determination surging through him. The battle was just beginning, and he would fight. Not just as a father, but as a judge who believed in justice. The sound of a locker slamming echoed down the school hallway as Nate Carter clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. A group of boys stood nearby, their laughter biting through the tense air. "Your dad just stood there while that cop slapped you," one boy sneered. "Guess he's not as tough as everyone says." Yeah, another added, smirking. Some judge he is. Can't even protect his own kid. Nate's hands trembled. He tried to walk away, his father's advice about fighting smart ringing in his ears. But the mocking wouldn't stop. Guess you're weak too, the first boy called out, shoving Nate's shoulder. That was it. Nate spun around, his fist connecting with the boy's jaw in a blur of motion. The laughter stopped, replaced by gasps and shouts. Teachers rushed in moments later to break up the fight, dragging Nate away as the other boy clutched his face, blood dripping from his nose. At home, Daniel sat across from Nate, the tension between them thick and unspoken. The suspension letter lay on the table, glaring evidence of the day's events. I didn't start it, Nate muttered, his gaze fixed on the floor. Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. But you finished it. Nate, I get it, you're angry. But this isn't the way to handle it. Then what is? Nate shot back, his voice cracking. Because you didn't handle it, Dad. You just stood there and let him hit me. Everyone's calling you weak, and me too. The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He reached for Nate's hand, but his son pulled away, retreating to his room. Daniel sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the suspension letter. He realized this wasn't just about Nate anymore. It was about the crushing weight of injustice and the toll it was taking on both of them. A week later, Daniel stood in the back of a crowded precinct meeting. The room buzzed with chatter, citizens voicing complaints and concerns. Mitch Turner sat casually at the front, his smug expression never faltering. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with determination. I'm here to address a pattern of misconduct by Officer Turner. Mitch's smirk widened as he leaned back in his chair, clearly unbothered. You're wasting your time, Judge Carter, he said, loud enough for the room to hear. These people don't want to hear your little sob story. The crowd murmured, some glancing between Daniel and Mitch with curiosity. Daniel ignored Mitch's taunts, pulling out his phone and subtly pressing record. I'm not here for a sob story, Daniel replied evenly. I'm here for accountability. And I have a feeling this room would like to know how many complaints you've swept under the rug, Officer Turner. The smile on Mitch's face faltered, just slightly, before he laughed. You're barking up the wrong tree, Judge. You can't touch me. This system protects its own. Chief Carter's got my back, and trust me, that means you've got nothing. The room fell silent. Daniel's heart pounded as he met Mitch's gaze. He knew he had struck a nerve, and Mitch's arrogance had just handed him the leverage he needed. Later that night, Daniel replayed the recording, the weight of Mitch's words sinking in. He sat in his study, surrounded by files and documents, piecing together the larger picture. Mitch's comment confirmed what Daniel had suspected. Chief Carter wasn't just protecting Mitch. He was orchestrating a culture of corruption within the precinct, shielding officers like Mitch while silencing complaints. Daniel stared at the evidence before him, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just a father seeking justice for his son. He was a man stepping into a war against a system designed to protect itself at all costs. Across town, Mitch leaned against his squad car, scrolling through his phone. He smirked as he saw the viral footage of Nate's fight at school, the comments mocking the Carter family. But beneath his confidence, a flicker of unease lingered. He knew Daniel Carter wasn't like the others he'd faced before. In the shadows of his office, Chief Carter stood by his desk, his jaw clenched as he listened to the same recording Daniel had captured. His eyes narrowed, and he picked up his phone. We need to keep an eye on Judge Carter, he muttered to the voice on the other end. He's going to be a problem. The lines were drawn, and the battle was just beginning. For Daniel, the fight wasn't just personal. It was a fight for justice, integrity, and the future his son deserved. Daniel Carter sat in his study, the glow of his desk lamp illuminating the mountain of paperwork in front of him. With each report, every line of testimony, and all the dismissed complaints, a clearer picture emerged. Mitch Turner was more than just a bad cop. He was a protected one. Daniel knew he needed to take the next step. Leaning back in his chair, Daniel picked up the phone and called an ally in the district attorney's office. Within days, he had filed an official complaint against Mitch, sparking an internal investigation. Daniel's name carried weight, and his evidence was damning. The precinct was forced to address the complaint, assigning it to their internal affairs department. But progress stalled almost immediately. Chief Carter, with his calm demeanor and sharp political instincts, subtly manipulated the investigation. Files were lost, interviews were delayed, and evidence was deemed inconclusive. It was clear to Daniel that the system was protecting itself, using bureaucracy as a weapon. Then the threats started. A week after filing the complaint, Daniel returned home to find an unmarked envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words scrawled in block letters: "Drop this, or else." Daniel crumpled the note in his fist, anger flaring briefly before his lawyerly composure returned. But the tension grew heavier when Nate found another note days later, tucked into their mailbox. This one was more explicit, warning Daniel to stop his witch hunt or face consequences that would hit close to home. That night, Daniel sat with Nate in the living room, the boy clutching the note tightly in his hands. "Are they going to hurt us?" Nate asked, his voice shaking. Daniel knelt before him, placing both hands firmly on his son's shoulders. "Listen to me, Nate. No one is going to hurt us. I won't let that happen. But this fight is bigger than us now. We have to be strong." Mitch Turner, emboldened by Chief Carter's backing, grew bolder in his harassment. He began parking his squad car outside the Carters' home, his presence a silent but menacing reminder. Every night, his headlights would cast long, eerie shadows across their driveway, making it impossible for Nate to sleep soundly. At school, Mitch's presence loomed even larger. He'd drop by unexpectedly, leaning casually against his car as Nate walked to class. Though Mitch never directly approached him, his piercing stare and the smug smirk on his face sent a clear message: "I'm watching you." One evening, as Daniel walked to his car after work, he noticed Mitch waiting in the parking lot. The officer leaned against his squad car, arms crossed, his smirk taunting. "You think your robe makes you untouchable?" Mitch called out as Daniel approached. "Think again." Daniel stopped, his back straight and his gaze unwavering. "I don't need a robe to see justice done," he replied coldly. "You and your kind don't scare me." Mitch's smirk faltered for a brief moment, before he turned, climbing into his car. But Daniel knew this was only the beginning. As the threats and intimidation escalated, Daniel buried himself deeper in his investigation. He worked late into the night, poring over financial records and connecting dots that painted a chilling picture. It started with small payments, anonymous donations funneled into the precinct's Community Outreach Fund. But the more Daniel traced the money, the more obvious the corruption became. Chief Carter wasn't just protecting officers like Mitch, he was benefiting from it. His financial ties led directly to local politicians who were quietly funding Carter's operations in exchange for favors that kept their own illicit activities hidden. Daniel's heart pounded as the scope of the corruption became clear. This wasn't just about Mitch Turner or Chief Carter. It was about a network of power and money that extended far beyond the precinct. But the deeper Daniel dug, the more isolated he became. Colleagues who once supported him now avoided his calls, fearful of being dragged into the mess. A close friend on the bench pulled him aside after a meeting. "Daniel, I respect what you're doing," the friend said, his voice low. "But you're making powerful enemies. Be careful." Daniel knew the risks. He knew the weight of what he was fighting against. But as he sat at his desk, staring at the threatening notes and the evidence he'd gathered, his resolve only grew stronger. For Nate, for justice, for every family that had been silenced by a corrupt system. The auditorium buzzed with the hum of a crowd gathered under the pretense of a community town hall meeting. Daniel Carter stood at the back of the room, watching as more people filled the rows of chairs. His heart pounded with anticipation. Tonight wasn't just about exposing Mitch Turner. It was about shining a light on the corruption festering in the precinct. Mitch Turner and Chief Carter walked in together, their confidence palpable. Mitch wore his trademark smirk, and Chief Carter radiated an aura of control, nodding curtly to a few officers seated near the front. They believed this meeting would end like so many others, with complaints buried under bureaucratic excuses and intimidation. What they didn't know was that Daniel had invited local journalists, community leaders, and civil rights activists. Cameras were already set up, and their lenses followed Mitch and Carter as they took their seats near the stage. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Daniel took the podium. Good evening, everyone, he began, his voice calm but commanding. Tonight, we gather to discuss issues that have plagued our community for far too long. Accountability, integrity, justice. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience. Daniel's eyes scanned the crowd, pausing briefly on Mitch and Carter, whose smug expressions began to waver. Partway through the meeting, Daniel paused, turning to face his son sitting in the front row. Nate, he said gently, would you like to share your story? Nate's hands gripped the edge of his chair. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of the room's attention pressing down on him. But then he stood, his voice steady despite the tremor of nerves. My name is Nate Carter, he began, looking directly at Mitch. 2 weeks ago, I was humiliated and assaulted by Officer Mitch Turner. He accused me of something I didn't do, and when I tried to explain myself, he slapped me. In front of my father, in front of strangers, and in front of people who just stood by and watched. The room was silent, save for the soft clicks of cameras capturing his every word. Nate's voice grew stronger as he continued. That day, I learned what it feels like to be powerless. But I also learned that staying silent lets people like Mitch Turner keep doing what they do. That's why I'm standing here tonight. Tears welled in Nate's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He turned toward his father, his voice unwavering. My dad taught me that fighting smart is better than fighting hard, and tonight, I'm fighting smart. The audience erupted in applause. Mitch shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the attention and scrutiny turning the tide against him. As the applause died down, Mitch stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, he barked, his voice cracking. You're all here to crucify me based on one kid's sob story? The room tensed. Daniel, still at the podium, remained calm. You're right, Mitch, he said. This isn't just about Nate. It's about every family who suffered because of unchecked power and corruption. Mitch sneered. You have no proof of anything. This is just a witch hunt. Daniel's lips curled into a faint smile. Oh, but I do have proof. From his pocket, Daniel pulled out a small recorder. The crowd leaned forward as he pressed play, and Mitch's voice echoed through the room. You can't touch me. This system protects its own. Chief Carter's got my back. Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras zoomed in on Chief Carter, whose composed facade cracked. Mitch's face turned a shade paler as he realized what was happening. And it doesn't end there, Daniel continued. He gestured toward a screen behind him, where documents appeared, financial records linking Chief Carter to backdoor deals with local politicians. This evidence shows the systemic corruption that's been poisoning this community for years. Complaints dismissed, families silenced, all to protect a network of power at the expense of justice. The room erupted into chaos. Shouts of outrage filled the air, journalists jostling for better shots as Mitch and Carter sat frozen in their seats. Mitch, in a last-ditch effort to save himself, lunged to grab the recorder from Daniel. But security stepped in, holding him back as the cameras captured every second. Chief Carter stood slowly, his voice icy. This is nothing but a smear campaign, he said, though the cracks in his composure were visible. You've overstepped, Judge Carter. Daniel stepped closer, his voice calm but resolute. No, Chief Carter. You overstepped when you chose power over integrity. And now, you'll face the consequences. By the time the meeting ended, the precinct's corruption was headline news. Videos of Nate's testimony and Daniel's revelations flooded social media, sparking protests and calls for reform. Back at home, Daniel and Nate sat together on the couch, the tension of the evening finally giving way to relief. I'm proud of you, Nate, Daniel said, his voice soft. You were brave tonight. Nate looked at his father, a small smile forming. I learned from the best. As they sat in the quiet of their living room, the weight of the battle they'd fought lingered. But so did the hope for change, hope that their fight had made a difference. The confrontation had ended, but the war for justice was far from over, and Daniel Carter was ready for whatever came next. The aftermath of the explosive town hall meeting rippled far beyond the walls of the community center. Within hours, Daniel Carter's evidence against Chief Carter and Officer Mitch Turner became headline news. Video clips of the recorded confession and financial documents spread across media platforms, creating a public uproar. As the pressure mounted, federal investigators descended upon the precinct, demanding records and questioning officers about the widespread corruption. Chief Carter, once untouchable, now faced an onslaught of scrutiny. His calm facade began to crack as investigators uncovered a tangled web of bribes, cover-ups, and alliances with local politicians. Mitch Turner was the first to fall. He was arrested on charges of assault and misconduct, and his smug demeanor evaporated in the face of mounting evidence. But Chief Carter, ever the strategist, tried to shift blame onto Mitch and other officers, painting himself as an unwitting participant. "I trusted my men," Carter said in a public statement, his voice laced with feigned regret. "If mistakes were made, I assure you, they were not mine." But Daniel wasn't fooled. He knew Carter was the mastermind behind the corruption, a man who had exploited the system to consolidate power. As federal investigators dug deeper, they found links between Carter and higher-ups in city government, revealing that the rot extended far beyond the local precinct. As the investigation widened, Daniel found himself at a crossroads. Mitch's conviction was inevitable, and Carter's downfall seemed imminent. But the evidence hinted at a much larger network of corruption, involving influential figures in politics and law enforcement. Pursuing them would mean taking on powerful enemies, risking not only his career, but also his family's safety. Late one evening, Daniel sat at the dining room table, stacks of documents spread before him. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his resolve was unbroken. Across from him sat Nate, his eyes filled with determination. "You've done enough, Dad," Nate said softly. "People know the truth now. Mitch is going to prison. Maybe it's time to let this go." Daniel looked at his son, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him. "If I stop now, Nate, it's not just Mitch who wins. It's everyone who protected him. Everyone who let this happen. And they'll just find someone else to take his place." Nate hesitated, then leaned forward. "I get it, Dad. I do. But what if they come after us? What if—" He stopped, his voice catching. Daniel reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Nate's. "Courage isn't about not being afraid," he said. "It's about doing what's right, even when you are." Nate's eyes glistened with unshed tears. After a moment, he nodded. "Then keep fighting," he said quietly. "We can't let them win." Daniel's decision to continue the fight inspired the community to rally behind him. Protests erupted outside the precinct and City Hall, demanding accountability from every official implicated in the corruption. Civil rights organizations and activists joined the cause, amplifying Daniel's voice on a national scale. But with the growing support came increased danger. One night, as Daniel worked late in his home office, a brick shattered his window. Attached was a note scrawled in red ink. "Back off, or your family pays the price." Nate found the note the next morning, his face pale as he handed it to his father. "This isn't just about you anymore, Dad," he said, his voice trembling. Daniel's heart ached as he saw the fear in his son's eyes. But instead of retreating, he used the incident to galvanize his resolve. "They're scared, Nate," he said. "They're scared because they know we won't back down." At the next press conference, Daniel addressed the threats directly. Standing before a sea of reporters and cameras, he declared, "We will not be silenced. Justice doesn't bend to fear, and neither will we." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing the strength of Daniel's words. The Carter family's bravery inspired others to come forward. Victims of police misconduct shared their stories, adding to the growing mountain of evidence against the corrupt network. Local businesses offered support, organizing fundraisers to assist families affected by the corruption. One evening, a group of community leaders gathered outside Daniel's home. "We wanted to thank you," an elderly man said, shaking Daniel's hand. "What you're doing, it's giving us hope. For the first time in years, we believe change is possible." As Daniel looked around at the faces of his neighbors, young and old, black and white, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just for Nate or himself. It was for every family who had suffered under the weight of injustice. Later that night, Daniel and Nate sat on the porch, the hum of cicadas filling the air. The tension that had defined their lives in recent weeks seemed to ease, if only for a moment. "Do you think it'll ever stop?" Nate asked, staring out into the darkened street. Daniel considered the question, his gaze thoughtful. Not all at once, he admitted. But every step we take gets us closer. Every fight we win makes the next one easier. Nate nodded, his expression a mix of exhaustion and hope. I'm proud of you, Dad, he said softly. Daniel smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. I'm proud of us, he replied. The story ended for the night, but the battle was far from over. Daniel's phone buzzed with a new message, its contents chilling. This isn't over, Judge Carter. Watch your back. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read the message, but instead of fear, determination burned in his eyes. He had come too far to turn back now. As he set the phone aside, the camera lingered on the father and son silhouetted against the night, their resilience shining through the darkness. The courtroom was packed, tension rippling through the air like static electricity. Daniel Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his gaze steady and unwavering as Mitch Turner was led in, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a grim, defeated expression. The judge read the verdict. Officer Mitch Turner is found guilty of assault and misconduct, sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. A wave of emotion swept over the room. For Daniel, it wasn't just a victory against Mitch, it was a testament to the power of perseverance. Nearby, reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail of the trial that had captured the nation's attention. The fallout didn't stop with Mitch. Chief Carter, under intense federal scrutiny and mounting evidence, resigned in disgrace. His carefully curated image shattered as more whistleblowers came forward, exposing a decade of corruption. The precinct, once an impenetrable fortress of power, was now the epicenter of reform. Daniel's relentless pursuit of justice sparked widespread change. A task force was established to overhaul the precinct, implementing mandatory de-escalation training and new accountability measures. Civil rights organizations praised Daniel's efforts, and his name became synonymous with courage in the face of systemic corruption. Back at home, Daniel and Nate stood on the front porch, the golden light of sunset casting a warm glow over their neighborhood. It was a moment of peace they hadn't felt in weeks. Nate looked up at his father, a newfound confidence shining in his eyes. We did it, didn't we? He asked, his voice filled with both wonder and relief. Daniel smiled, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. We did. But this wasn't just about winning, Nate. It was about standing up for what's right. Nate nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking in. I didn't think I could do it, he admitted. Standing up at the town hall, facing all those people, I was scared. Daniel crouched slightly, meeting Nate's gaze directly. Courage isn't the absence of fear, he said gently. It's standing up despite it. And you, Nate, you showed more courage than most adults ever will. For the first time in weeks, Nate smiled fully, his shoulders no longer burdened by doubt. Their bond, tested and strained by the challenges they had faced, felt stronger than ever. Life slowly began returning to normal for the Carters, though the echoes of their fight lingered. Daniel returned to the courthouse, his days filled with cases, his reputation as a fair but unyielding judge now even more respected. Nate, once hesitant to walk the school hallways, now held his head high. His peers no longer saw him as a victim, but as someone who had stood his ground. One evening, as Daniel prepared for his next case, a letter arrived at their home. It was unmarked, the handwriting on the envelope unfamiliar. Inside, a single sentence was scrawled. You may have won this time, but we're still watching. Daniel read the note twice, his jaw tightening. He set it down carefully, turning to the window where the soft glow of streetlights illuminated the quiet street. The fight wasn't over. He knew that much. But instead of fear, he felt a deep resolve. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk, a picture of him and Nate from years ago, their faces lit with laughter. It reminded him of why he fought so hard, why he wouldn't stop. As the evening settled around them, Daniel joined Nate on the porch, where they often spent their quiet moments together. Nate was flipping through a book, his feet propped up on the railing. Another case tomorrow? Nate asked without looking up. Yeah, Daniel replied, sitting beside him. But nothing we can't handle. Nate smirked. We? Daniel chuckled. That's right. I couldn't have gotten through this without you. The two sat in companionable silence, the shared understanding between them unspoken but deeply felt. As the camera pulled back, the scene framed Daniel and Nate silhouetted against the soft glow of their porch light. Despite the shadows looming over their victory, the image radiated strength, resilience, and hope. Their fight had revealed the cracks in a deeply flawed system, and though they had won this battle, they knew the war was far from over. The screen faded to black, leaving the audience with a sense of determination. Justice might be a long and arduous road, but it was a road worth traveling. If this story of resilience, justice, and the fight against systemic corruption moved you, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts. Join the conversation about standing up for what's right, and let's keep the fight for accountability and equality alive. Subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire change.